Welcome to Ghost Stories for Christmas 2023. My name is Lex Jones and I'm going to be reading Salt the Slug by Kayleigh Dobbs. When Andrew's eyes opened, he didn't recognise the ceiling above him. Ceilings weren't normally a cause for alarm, but this particular one, a stranger, loomed over him all grand and concave. He blinked once, twice, and then squeezed his eyes shut. "Okay," he muttered, and then opened them again. "Same ceiling, goddamn son of a bitch. What the bloody hell?" He groped for the right side of the bed and started to pull himself up, uttering the usual groan that came with decades of a sore hip. His hip didn't actually feel sore right now, but moaning about it had become a habit and one he rather enjoyed. Only his bed wasn't quite right either. The side of the bed sat higher than him, and it was cold and hard. The realisation that it was not in his bed at all, but a box, was enough to startle him all the way up into a sitting position. The sounds of sniffling and muted weeping drew his eyes to his right, where he saw everyone he knew sitting in pews facing him, looking all forlorn and such. "What the bloody hell?" he repeated, his head swaying back and forth, left to right. "Marjorie!" His wife was sitting there in a front pew, a crumpled, dampened tissue clamped in her small, wrinkled hands. "Marjorie!" he yelled this time, but she paid him no mind. She was glancing around the room, her eyes resting on the faces of their friends and family, flitting to the biblical tapestries on the walls, glancing up at the hideous ceiling. She looked everywhere but at him, which wasn't really out of the ordinary, truth be told. "What in the hell are you all doing?" he croaked, wondering what the joke could be. Why were they all dressed in black? So morbid. And why was he up front on some sort of stage? And how had he come to be here? The last thing he remembered was... Oh dear. The last thing he remembered was clutching his throat on the floor of his kitchen, Marjorie flapping over him when the stupid bitch should have been calling an ambulance. There'd been tightness, pain, the inability to breathe, and an overwhelming irritation with the fact that his wife apparently couldn't think straight in a crisis. And then, nothing. Until now. Until he'd woken up in... He looked to his left, saw the lid of his own coffin standing open, and started shrieking. He clambered to his knees and then flung himself sideways, tumbling several feet to the floor, screaming all the while. He screamed as he struggled to his feet, screeched as he lumbered past the officiant conducting the service, and wailed as he staggered into the walkway between the pews. "Hello, I'm here. Can you see me?" He didn't recognise his own voice, so such was the pitch. He looked at each of them in turn, dozens of them, as they sat there staring ahead or into their laps like morons, ignorant morons. "Marjorie!" he shouted, striding towards her. She raised her head and just for a second seemed to lock eyes with him, but when no recognition appeared on her face, he realised she must have been staring through him. The thought gave him the willies and only served to shove him even further into panic. Not that there was much further to go in that regard. His voice was already as shrill as he had ever heard it. Standing directly in front of his beloved, he waved his arms and screamed at her to see him. He even tried to grab hold of her, but his hands passed right through her bony shoulders. Marjorie, unaware of his presence, wept into her tissue with her head bowed the whole time. 10 minutes later, Andrew had exhausted himself, hearing his own inaudible panic attack reverberate back at him from every angle of the stupid church, while no one else could hear it, was a peculiar and infuriating experience. After screaming himself hoarse, he descended into a rage of sorts. He didn't even recognise this church, so why Marjorie would have organised his funeral to be held here, he didn't know. In fact, he recalled mentioning several times as they headed into their final years that he wished to be cremated. There were to be no open coffin shenanigans, and preferably the whole thing would be held in the crematorium. He'd never been one for religion. His stupid, gullible wife was a god squad. She bought into all the superstitious mumbo-jumbo, but this wasn't her day, was it? It was his. Marjorie had annoyed him for most of their lives with her habit of pretending to listen to him when she wasn't, but this took the biscuit. What kind of daft bitch did the exact opposite of her dear husband's last wishes? "And now, Marjorie, Andrew's wife, would like to say a few words," the man in the white collar said. Andrew didn't much like the look of him either. Marjorie knew how he felt about millennials. The least she could have done was book someone of a less annoying age to put him to rest. This guy was 30 tops, and he was handsome, and that made him more annoying somehow. Maybe that's why he was standing here, all invisible. Maybe this chump didn't know what he was doing. Maybe, and the more Andrew thought on this, the more convinced he became of it, the reason he was a ghost was because everyone involved had botched his funeral. "Marjorie, you all right?" the stupid young man asked. Andrew looked to her, waiting for his eulogy. Hearing her lament about their good times and his many attributes would cheer him up. If he had to be dead, at least he'd get to listen to his wife grieve sweetly and sing his praises. He'd finally get to listen to her say something nice about him, respectable like. Her career had been in the theatre, and she'd been both a talented writer and performer. She spent decades treading the boards, and, though he had never felt the need to tell her, not even once, she had always been a terrific public speaker. But instead of getting up and doing her wifely duty, the duty she owed him, goddammit, she just sat there and, with an almighty sob, shook her head. Marjorie is unable to speak at this time, the idiot said, but you'll find a condensed version of her eulogy at the back of your programmes. A condensed version! He glared at Marjorie as she sat there, weeping in her black cardigan and ankle-length pleated skirt. The brooch she wore glittered under the artificial lights that ruined the authenticity of the old building, and he hated it. He had always hated brooches. He remembered when Marjorie had started wearing them about 20 years back. He told her then that the aged her made her look like she belonged with the rest of the doddering old biddies she was friends with, but she wouldn't listen, she never did. She'd given him the finger and carried on wearing them. In fact, she bought several more. She started there wearing them everywhere just to spite him. And now, look, here she was at his funeral wearing the biggest, most obnoxious and tacky brooch she owned. Some sort of spider of all things. She might not have been giving him the finger as she sat there in her pew, but she was definitely flipping him off. It was in that moment that he decided he would haunt her, maliciously if possible. All he had to do was figure out how to make his presence known, and he'd scare her into an early grave right along with him. That would show her. Her refusal to give a eulogy was only the start of how Marjorie would annoy him that day. He followed her from the church to the graveyard and had to watch his coffin as it was lowered into the ground. It was a disturbing experience, but there wasn't much room for it in his brain because he was mostly just full of rage that she was burying him when he specifically told her he didn't want to be buried. Graves and coffins were such a waste of money, and he wondered how she was able to afford it. She spent their whole marriage as a housewife while he went out to work, and she only had access to the account he put the bill money in. She didn't know about his other bank account, which held a sizable nest egg. He'd been transferring most of his money into it for years. He didn't know what for, really. He just didn't want it in Marjorie's grabby little hands. Back in the day when he put extra money in their shared account, she'd always frittered it away on stupid things like that new ironing board. There was nothing wrong with the old one. She did complain that one of the legs was bent and she struggled to get it up, but in his opinion that didn't warrant spending a whole £25 on a new one. Don't even get him started on that new coat she bought in 1985. There was nothing wrong with the one she already had, besides a few holes. The woman just liked to spend his money like there was no tomorrow. He continued to obsess about the cost of his own funeral when they got to the workman's club for his wake. She'd gone all out on the buffet, not just a cheap one with ham sandwiches and sausage rolls either. There were Scotch eggs, the big ones, chocolates, dips, and hummus, and oh my fucking god, Andrew thought, is that smoked salmon? He wandered around a little, trying to listen in on the flattering conversations that his former colleagues and friends surely would have been engaging in, but every time he joined a group, unbeknownst to them, they were talking about other trivial matters like their hobbies and their stupid, snotty little grandkids. That irritated him pretty quickly, and he decided that maybe it might be less annoying to stick with Marjorie after all. But every time he tried to settle near her, she wandered off into the women's toilets, and he'd be damned if he was following her in there. Fuck knows what women did in the toilets, but it disturbed him that they seemed to always go in pairs. He ended up standing in a corner with his arms folded, glaring at everyone as they gobbled over fancy crisps and breadsticks until Marjorie's taxi finally arrived to take them home. Only he didn't manage to get in. He forgot he was dead for a moment. The taxi driver helped her in and closed the door, and then, of course, Andrew couldn't open it again. His hand just passed right through the handle. "Oi!" he yelled as the taxi took off, leaving him in the dust. He looked in all directions, recognising absolutely nothing. He wandered aimlessly back and forth for a while, taking in the local sights, realising with an intensifying fury that this wasn't even his town. In the end, he just had to randomly pick a direction, hope for the best, and start walking. Not only had his absolute cunt of a wife done the opposite of everything he'd wanted for his own funeral, but she'd clearly gone senile because she'd also booked the whole thing and put his body to rest somewhere he'd never even been. Fortunately for Andrew, it took him almost a full day of walking up the world's longest country road before he finally found a sign with a town name that he recognised on it. As it turned out, he'd gone the wrong way and was now almost 2 days' walk away from his own house. He considered not going back. Perhaps now that he was free and no longer affected by inconveniences like his sore hip or fatigue, he would explore the world. He could wander the globe, visiting all those places he's always wanted to see, but hadn't wanted to shell out for a holiday to travel to. He stood at a literal crossroads for a minute, mulling that over. Maybe he'd wander up to Scotland. He'd never been. That might be a good start. From there he could get on a ferry to France. He'd never been there either. But then he thought about Marjorie, sitting in the house he'd paid for with her feet up, while he was stranded miles away because she'd held his funeral in the back end of nowhere. If he didn't go home, he couldn't make her suffer, and now he very badly wanted her to suffer. He turned around. Andrew made it back eventually, days later. Of course, the front door was closed and he couldn't open it to get in. His hand kept passing through the handle. The logical answer seemed to be to simply pass through the door, but when he tried, he found he couldn't. It stopped him, just like he was still made of flesh and bone, which thoroughly perplexed him, because if his hand passed through the handle, then it made sense that he ought to be able to just slip through the whole door. It started to pour with rain. He couldn't feel the cold, but it still made his situation gloomier. He marched down the porch steps and followed the side of the house, trying in vain to trample his wife's flower beds on his way to the living room window. He peered in, swearing at the stupid net curtain that obscured his view. She was just a colourful shape through the netted gaps, but there she was all right, in his chair. "Marjorie!" he hollered, banging the window. He could hear his fist connect, but had the sinking feeling that the sound was audible only to him. "Oi!" He carried on like that for a while, but Marjorie didn't move. She was probably chortling away at one of her stupid women's shows, oblivious. Though physical exhaustion no longer existed, he did eventually run out of the mental steam required to swear and scream at his wife, and he stopped. He slumped down onto the grass. At some point, Marjorie's face did appear at the window. He looked up at her from the ground, snarling, but she didn't see him. Her eyes scanned the land around their remote farmland home, the surrounding woods on either side of the main road, and the skies, and she smiled into the rain, like an imbecile. Then she was gone, the lights went out, and Andrew grumbled as he imagined her crawling into their warm, comfy bed. 3 days he was out there. He'd given up on screaming at Marjorie through the windows or banging on the side of the house. He'd spent the best part of the second day convinced that if he'd just concentrated hard enough, he was able to pick things up, like that guy from Ghost. He desperately wanted to wait until she was good and relaxed, and then scare the shit out of her by throwing rocks through the windows. But alas, movie rules did not apply. He'd been lying motionless on his back, staring at the sky, when 2 delivery guys in a van arrived. Andrew sat up and watched as they unloaded an enormous flat-screen TV and hefted it up the porch steps. "Wrong address, dipshits," Andrew scoffed, amused by the knowledge that when Marjorie answered the door, they'd realise their mistake and have to carry the ridiculous thing back to the van. It looked heavy, but when she opened the door, she smiled at them and ushered them inside. Andrew jumped to his feet and followed them, stopping short when the one at the back abruptly froze and looked down. He supposed he wouldn't have actually bumped into him, but reflexes took over. He followed the man's gaze down to a thick line of salt, which now scuffed every which way from the strange men sliding into the stupidly big TV through it. "Slugs," he and Marjorie said together, she to them and he to himself, with a hard eye roll. If he had a penny for every time he disturbed a rogue patch of salt, even though he'd only ever seen 1 slug in their room for their entire marriage. Still, his annoyance at her weird habit was, this time, totally engulfed by the fact that he was finally inside. He was elated. He still couldn't move anything, but being on the other side of the door was a start, at least. He pottered around as the men sat about, destroying his wall by fixing a TV bracket to it. His attempts to distract them and make them drop what he had now overheard was a TV that cost in excess of $3,000 had failed, so he wandered off. Everything upstairs was the same, except that Marjorie had changed the bedding to something brand new, and that irked the shit out of him. There were butterflies all over the duvet cover, and she knew how much he hated those fluttering little fucks. And didn't the widowed usually keep the smell of their dearly departed spouse around for as long as possible? Less than a week he'd been dead, and there she was tossing out what was left of him. He'd envisioned her crying into his pillow, sniffing in the lingering smell of his head. Instead, she'd changed the bedding and bought a new pillow and duvet set. The woman was on some mad spending spree, clearly. It must be the grease, Andrew figured. He'd heard it did some funny things to people. He almost felt sorry for her, bringing herself into debt because she couldn't cope without him. He smiled at the thought as he went back downstairs and wandered around the kitchen. But wait a minute, what was this? Dishes in the sink? She hadn't left dirty dishes lying around like that in decades, not since their last fight about it. He was the one bringing in the money, so the least she could do was keep a clean house. He'd been harsh during that fight, but he'd done her a favour. Women like keeping a clean house, don't they? It's built into them the same way that cooking is, the same way that ironing is. Andrew had never successfully ironed anything, but that didn't matter because it wasn't his job. He glared at the dirty dishes just sitting there, wondering if they were an indication that he was suffering some sort of women's melancholy. He looked at her through the open doors as she flitted around the TV menu, beaming at the atrocity that was being mounted on his wall. She was acting very strange, very out of character. Must be the depression. And, he turned his head to the peculiar plant that was smouldering away on the kitchen table. What the fuck was that plant she was burning? He'd noticed it upstairs in both the bathroom and bedroom too, some weird tuft of something green that she was setting alight all over the goddamn house. She'd lost her marbles. That night, he was forced to sit on the sofa while she lounged in his chair with her feet up on his footstool. She was watching the TV, and since boredom was taking root rather deeply in him, he'd figured he may as well join her. She didn't even have the decency to watch one of their soaps or the sports. She put on a film, The Devil Wears Prada. He tutted, sighed, yelled at her to change the channel to something they could both enjoy. She knew damn well that he wouldn't want that feminist shit about a career woman on in his house. Just when he thought it couldn't get worse, there was a makeover scene, and he alternated between berating his wife and the TV itself. Marjorie took her hearing aid out and fiddled with it. Must not have been working, because she then proceeded to whack the volume of the TV up. It was deafening. Andrew couldn't stand the noise, and he promptly got up and stomped upstairs. At around 10, when he expected Marjorie to come to bed and keep him company, he found that, once again, he was left disappointed. She didn't come upstairs. She started watching Sex and the City instead. He heard that annoying theme tune, doing from the living room. She didn't come up at 11 or even 12. It was past 1 when she finally deigned to turn in. Though he knew she couldn't hear it, he ranted at her for 30 minutes straight. He might not have been able to ruin a night with an argument, but venting still made him feel a bit better anyway. She tossed and turned next to him, whimpering every now and then. Almost an hour later, she spoke. He stopped muttering at her, surprised, watching, wondering if he'd finally broken through the veil, whatever that was. Then he realised the stupid cow was praying, actually praying. She clasped her hands on her chest and stared up at the ceiling. "Dear God, if you're listening, please take good care of my Andrew. You took him too soon," she whispered. Andrew could scarcely believe his ears, but he was pleased that she was finally coming to her senses and having the decency to be upset. "And Andrew, if you can hear me," she drew in a shuddering breath and closed her eyes, "please know that you can rest now." He swore at her for several minutes, and perhaps that was a part of her that picked up on his energy because she struggled to sleep that night. The next day, she went out. He'd followed her, fuming as she took his keys just like that, just like she had a right to drive his car, which she very well knew she wasn't allowed to do. He intended to go with her just to get out of the house, but she slammed the front door behind her before he could slip out, trapping him inside. It was irksome, but better than being trapped outside, he supposed. At least that's what he thought at first, but being stuck in your house isn't any fun when you can't interact with anything. He couldn't pick up a book or turn on the radio or watch that infuriatingly expensive TV. All he could do was loaf around. After a couple of hours, he found himself missing Marjorie for the first time in his existence. It was lonely without her, even if all he wanted to do was berate her for when she was around. Feeling blue and wondering if her woman's melancholia had somehow contaminated him, he took to gazing out of the windows. That wasn't peaceful for long, though, because of the salt. She'd salted every window ledge. How many slugs did she think were trying to break in, for God's sake? He studied her books. It was all mysticism and folklore and other nonsense. He looked at the crystals that littered every shelf. He always hated those things. She thought they had powers. Just to prove her wrong, he'd throw one in the bin now and then just to see if she noticed. How he wished he could just sweep them all into the trash now. Eventually, the daft bin returned. She had a lot of boxes and some help. Friends from a church, he thought, though he couldn't be sure because he would never bother to make an effort with her friends. To his horror, the four of them started packing his stuff away. Clothing, his vinyls, his trinkets, even his crockery. The first thing he saw Marjorie box up was his "World's Best Husband" mug. Completely impotent, he took turns following each of them, trying to snatch his stuff back, his arms passing through his treasures. It had taken going on 40 years to fill his house, and now he had been emptied from it in only a few hours, all traces of him discarded. Marjorie watched from the doorstep as her friends drove off with their cars full. "You bloody bitch," Andrew muttered over her shoulder, watching his belongings vanish into the distance. "I'm barely cold in the ground. You didn't even keep a memento." Marjorie heaved out a hefty sigh and closed the front door slowly. Then she went to the phone in the kitchen wall and held it to her ear, dialing. "It's me," she answered to whoever answered. "I think I need plan B." "Thanks, see you soon." She hung up and started crying. Andrew watched her cry, confused but pleased. Finally, grief, remorse, possibly even the realisation that she had been too hasty to cast all memory of him aside. And then she looked up. He turned and looked behind him, wondering what had suddenly caught her attention. He turned back, and she was still staring. "Why won't you just fuck off?" she asked him. Andrew blinked, gasped, pressed a hand to his chest. "Me?" "Me?" she repeated, mocking his tone. "Of course you. You can see me. See you, hear you, every bloody minute of the day. Shouldn't you be moving on or something?" "Well, I don't know, Marjorie. I've never been dead before." They glared at each other for a moment, Marjorie breathing heavily and swatting at the furious tears that streaked her cheeks. Andrew simulated breathing heavily just out of habit. Andrew's brow furrowed. Wait a minute, what did you mean, why won't you just fuck off? Oh. Marjorie shook her head and flung her hands into the air, then brought them down into fists that rested on her hips. You've been bugging me for days. You've been able to see me this whole time? He exploded. I wish I couldn't. Do you have any idea how annoying you are? I could still hear you whining even if I turned my hearing aid off. Yeah, this is you. Andrew wanted to rush forward and shake her, slap her even. He didn't know what to say. Why have you been pretending not to see me? Because I thought you'd just go away if you had nothing to hang around for, Marjorie exploded back. But no, isn't there a light you can go into or something? It took me a whole day to walk back here. I tried praying you away, but nope, there you are in the morning. I was stuck outside for 3 days and you knew I was out there. Get rid of all your stuff in case you were attached to an object, but here you still are. Made me watch hours and hours of those stupid woman movies. You're a prick, Andy. You watch your tone, Andrew yelled, jabbing a finger at her. She looked at it, and then, much to his absolute fury, started laughing. Hanging around for all that money you squirreled away, she wheezed. That stopped him dead. If you weren't such a self-centered twat, you'd have noticed I found out about it years ago. How do you think I've been affording to keep my hair and nails nice all these years? You'll pay for this, he threatened, sincerely hell-bent on making good with the promise. Give over, what are you gonna do? She had a twinkle in her eye for the first time in decades. I know you can't touch anything. They stood there glaring at each other, at an impasse, both of them struggling to come up with a witty insult and failing. Marjorie's face softened, but she still looked troubled. Is it me you're attached to? She asked. Why can't you just cross over? Pull the other one, Andrew replied, as unkindly as he could muster. Why would I be attached to you? But her question wasn't what he'd first thought, and he realised that when her eyes darted, just for a second, to the spot on the kitchen floor where he choked to death on his dinner, it slowly dawned on him as she twiddled her thumbs that she wasn't asking out of some marital bond, but rather the possibility that he was seeking revenge. Oh my God, you killed me, he cried, and lunged at her with outstretched hands. He stumbled right through her. Oh, I did not. You choked, she reminded him, and then after a pause, I just didn't help. You let me die, he corrected himself. Marjorie shrugged. In some ways it was worse than she just allowed him to go, rather than having the guts to murder him. He might have respected her a bit. You'll never be rid of me, he said, smirking. I might not be able to touch you, but you can hear me, can't you? The smile fell off his wife's triumphant face. You can kiss goodbye to everyone having a good night's sleep again. Once again they stood there staring at each other, and then, as always, they continued to argue. A few minutes later, someone turned up and interrupted them. Hello, Mrs. Wicks, came a familiar voice. Oh, thank God, Marjorie wailed, running straight through Andrew towards the young priest from his funeral. Marjorie pointed an accusing finger at Andrew. He's right there. Mr. Wicks, I'm Father Stephen Ryan, the youth declared, looking in his general direction but not seeing him. What kind of person has a first name for a surname? Andrew thought. Ridiculous. There's no point in trying to reason with him, Marjorie told him. Father Ryan squeezed her shoulder and smiled. Not to worry, Mrs. Wicks, he's not the first one I've dealt with, but business first. Oh, of course. Marjorie grabbed her handbag, fished through it, and then handed the priest an enormous wad of cash. My cash, Andrew realised, incensed. Father Ryan thanked her and took the money into his coat, and then he cleared his throat and turned back towards Andrew, his gaze slightly off so he was looking just to the side of him. Sir, I'm giving you one opportunity to agree to cross over. I can help you. Pull the other one, Andrew retorted, crossing his arms. I'll not be ousted from my own house, thank you very much. Marjorie repeated what he said to the priest, who smiled, shook his head, and Marjorie repeated what she'd said to the priest, who smiled and shook his head. Okay, I gave you a chance, the young man said, and started to usher Marjorie towards the door. Oh, this is really the only option, she complained. I just got a lovely new TV. But she allowed him to lead her outside. Andrew went rushing behind them, but he needn't have worried, because they didn't bother to close the door. They were muttering to each other about passports. Andrew, getting angry by the second, ranted and raved until they stepped off the property, and then all of a sudden he found he couldn't take another step forward. He didn't hit anything exactly, but it was like there was a wall before him. He tried again, but it was just like when he tried to pass through his front door. He looked down to see the thickest line of salt. He followed it left with his eyes until it went out of sight, and then to the right, where it also trailed. He turned, looking at the land either side of his house, realising that this white-collared weirdo had made a ring of salt that he suspected went all the way around his house. So long, sucker, Marjorie chuckled. Father Ryan tuttered. Mrs. Wicks, it's very unkind to gloat. He deserves it, Marjorie sneered. That he does, Father Ryan agreed, but the best revenge is living your best life, so go on. And you're sure he can't? Marjorie trailed off, looking at Andrew a little nervously for the first time. Even if we couldn't exercise him, and I assure you that we can and will, By the time the circle breaks, you'll be at the airport and you'll never know where you went anyway, the priest assured her. Exercise me, Andrew spluttered, his eyes darting in every direction. He didn't like the use of we in the man's last statement. He squinted into the surrounding nature. Were those more priests waiting in the tree line? And you're sure it's necessary to... Marjorie gestured towards the house. Father Ryan grimaced and nodded. I'm afraid so. These sorts of rituals tend to rely on fire. What? Andrew yelped. Go on now, Mrs. Wicks. There's a taxi waiting. The priest pointed towards the main road. Marjorie hugged and thanked him and then turned to Andrew with a sad smile upon her face. Andrew, these are the last words you'll ever hear from me, so I hope you're listening. For once, Andrew shut up and waited, actually interested in what she had to say. She drew in a breath, steeling herself. You were a below-average lover and a disappointing husband. And with that, Marjorie disappeared down the road. Andrew, all bravado swiftly vanishing, looked around in all directions. Oh God, they were priests and they were closing in. Some of them were holding torches. What was this? The Stone Age? And, oh God, Andrew turned and fled back towards his house. They were chanting something in Latin. That couldn't be good. Marjorie was almost 15 minutes away by the time her house went up in flames, and though she couldn't see the inferno from the window of her taxi, she fancied she could still smell the smoke, and she smiled. And that's the end. Hope you enjoyed it. Please keep tuned for other Ghost Stories for Christmas 22 entries from other authors, and good night.